What if the world is witnessing the beginning of a conflict that could change the Middle East forever? Over the past few hours, tensions between the United States and Iran have reached a level that many experts describe as extremely dangerous. American military movements are increasing across the region. Strategic bombers have reportedly been repositioned. U.S. bases are on high alert. And behind closed doors, diplomatic channels are becoming more and more tense. But here's the real question nobody can ignore anymore. Are the United States preparing direct strikes against Iran? Because right now, this no longer looks like a simple political standoff. The tone coming from Washington has changed dramatically. The warnings are sharper, the pressure is stronger, and Tehran is responding with threats of massive retaliation if American forces cross what Iran considers a red line. This is the kind of atmosphere that usually exists just before a major escalation. And what makes this situation even more alarming is the fact that a war with Iran would not look like previous American wars in the Middle East. Iran is not an isolated country with limited influence. It has missiles capable of reaching strategic targets across the region. It has powerful allies. It has networks spread across multiple countries. And if a direct confrontation begins, the consequences could move far beyond Iran itself. Oil prices could explode overnight. Regional conflicts could ignite simultaneously. International markets could panic, and global powers could quickly be dragged into a much larger geopolitical crisis. That's why governments around the world are watching every military movement very carefully right now. Because sometimes, history changes in just a few hours. And according to several analysts, the current situation feels dangerously close to one of those moments. The most worrying part? Neither Washington nor Tehran appears willing to back down. And when two powerful nations continue raising the pressure at the same time, the risk of a direct clash increases dramatically. So tonight, one question is dominating international discussions. Are we witnessing another temporary crisis, or the opening moments of a new war in the Middle East? To understand why the situation is becoming so dangerous, we need to look at what has been happening behind the scenes over the last few weeks. Officially, the United States accuses Iran of increasing support for armed groups operating across the Middle East. Washington claims that American interests, military bases, and allies in the region are facing growing threats linked to Tehran's influence. But this crisis goes much deeper than that. At the center of the tension is Iran's nuclear program. For years, Western governments have feared that Iran could move closer to developing nuclear weapons capabilities. Tehran continues to insist that its program is for civilian purposes, but many intelligence agencies believe Iran now possesses enough technical knowledge to rapidly increase its nuclear potential if it chooses to do so. And for the United States, as well as several allies in the region, that possibility is viewed as a major strategic threat. But here's where things become much more serious. This is no longer just about diplomacy or negotiations. Military signals are now replacing political language. American forces have reportedly increased their readiness in key areas around the Persian Gulf. Surveillance operations are intensifying. Strategic assets are being repositioned, and every one of those movements sends a message directly to Tehran. The message is simple. Washington wants Iran to understand that military action is no longer being ruled out. And Iran is responding with equally aggressive rhetoric. Iranian officials have warned that any American strike would trigger a powerful response. Some military commanders have even suggested that U.S. bases across the region could become immediate targets in the event of escalation. In other words, both sides are publicly preparing for the possibility of confrontation. And historically, that is exactly the kind of dynamic that can become extremely dangerous very quickly. Because once both nations start raising military pressure at the same time, even a single incident can spiral out of control. A drone shot down, a missile interception, an attack by a regional armed group. One mistake is sometimes enough to trigger a chain reaction nobody originally intended. And that's what makes the current moment so critical. This isn't just another diplomatic disagreement between two rival countries. This is a situation where military preparation, political pressure, and global geopolitical interests are all colliding at the same time, which means the next decisions made in Washington and Tehran could determine whether this crisis cools down or moves into a completely different phase. Now comes the most important question. Is this entire crisis simply a show of force? Or are the United States genuinely preparing for military strikes against Iran? Because, according to several military analysts, what we are seeing right now goes far beyond ordinary political pressure. When the U.S. military begins repositioning strategic bombers, increasing naval presence, and raising the alert level of regional bases, it usually serves two purposes. First, intimidation. Second, preparation. And many experts believe Washington may currently be trying to create maximum pressure on Tehran while simultaneously preparing military options in case diplomacy completely collapses. But if strikes were to happen, they would most likely not begin as a full-scale invasion. Instead, analysts believe the United States could launch highly targeted operations designed to hit strategic Iranian infrastructure. Possible targets could include missile facilities, military command centers, drone production sites, or locations linked to Iran's nuclear program. The goal would be very clear: damage Iran's strategic capabilities quickly, demonstrate American military superiority, and force Tehran into a weaker negotiating position. But this is where the danger becomes enormous. Because once the first strike happens, nobody can truly control what comes next. Iran has spent years preparing for exactly this type of scenario. Unlike some previous conflicts in the Middle East, Iran possesses significant retaliatory capabilities. Its missile arsenal is one of the largest in the region. It also has networks and allied groups operating across several countries, capable of responding indirectly against American interests. That means a conflict would not necessarily stay limited to Iran itself. U.S. military bases in the region could become targets. Commercial shipping routes could be threatened. Energy infrastructure in the Gulf could be attacked. And global oil markets could react instantly. In fact, one of the biggest fears among international leaders right now is not only the military confrontation itself, but the economic shockwave that could follow. Because the Middle East remains one of the most strategically important energy regions on Earth. Even a limited conflict involving Iran could send oil prices surging worldwide, increase inflation, destabilize financial markets, and create political pressure across multiple countries already facing economic difficulties. And there's another major problem for Washington. A rapid military operation is always easier to start than to finish. American leaders know that a limited strike could quickly evolve into a prolonged regional crisis if Iran chooses to retaliate aggressively. That is why the current situation feels so unpredictable. On one side, the United States wants to project strength and deterrence. On the other side, Iran wants to show that it cannot be intimidated. And when both sides are trying to prove they are willing to escalate, the possibility of miscalculation becomes extremely high. Which is why many observers believe the world may now be entering one of the most dangerous phases of this crisis so far. What makes this situation even more alarming is that concern is no longer limited to Washington and Tehran. Governments around the world are now closely monitoring every development because the fear is no longer about a local crisis. It's about a regional explosion with global consequences. Behind the scenes, several countries in the Middle East have reportedly increased security measures around critical infrastructure and military sites. Intelligence services are watching the situation hour by hour trying to determine whether the current escalation is still political pressure or the final stage before direct confrontation. And the reason for this growing anxiety is simple. Everyone understands how quickly the Middle East can spiral into chaos once military escalation begins. This region is already filled with tensions, rival alliances, proxy conflicts, and strategic interests involving some of the world's most powerful nations, which means a direct clash between the United States and Iran would almost certainly not remain isolated for very long. Some countries fear attacks on oil facilities. Others fear disruptions to global shipping routes, especially around strategic maritime choke points that are essential for international trade and energy supplies. Because if those routes become unstable, the economic consequences could spread worldwide almost immediately. Energy prices could surge. Financial markets could panic. Inflation could worsen globally. And governments already dealing with fragile economies would suddenly face another major international crisis. But beyond the economic fears, there is also a major geopolitical concern growing inside international capitals. What happens if other powers become indirectly involved? Because in today's world, conflicts are rarely contained to only two countries. Every major escalation creates pressure on alliances, military partnerships, and global diplomacy. And that's why international leaders are trying to avoid a scenario where one strike leads to retaliation, then retaliation leads to a wider regional confrontation. The most dangerous part is that crises like this often escalate faster than political leaders expect. History has shown it many times. At the beginning, everyone believes the situation can still be controlled, until suddenly, one incident changes everything. And according to several analysts, that is exactly why the current atmosphere feels so tense. Not because war is guaranteed, but because the margin for error is becoming smaller and smaller. One military incident, one failed negotiation, one unexpected attack. That's sometimes all it takes to push a crisis into a completely different dimension. And tonight, many governments appear to be preparing for the possibility that the next few hours, or the next few days, could become decisive for the entire region. Right now, nobody can say with certainty whether the United States will actually launch strikes against Iran. But what is certain is this: the level of tension has entered extremely dangerous territory. The military signals are multiplying, the rhetoric is becoming more aggressive, and both Washington and Tehran appear determined to show strength rather than weakness. That is exactly what worries international observers the most, because history has repeatedly shown that major conflicts often begin during moments when both sides believe the other will eventually back down, until suddenly, nobody does. And this is what makes the current crisis feel so unpredictable. On one side, the United States wants to maintain pressure and prove that its warnings are credible. On the other side, Iran wants to demonstrate that it cannot be intimidated by military threats or strategic pressure. The problem is that when both nations continue escalating simultaneously, the space for diplomacy becomes smaller with every passing day. And in situations like this, events can move very quickly. A single military incident could completely change the direction of the crisis overnight. One missile strike, one attack on a military base, one fatal miscalculation. That's all it could take to move from tension to open confrontation. And if that happens, the consequences would likely extend far beyond the Middle East itself. Global markets would react immediately. Energy prices could spike worldwide. International alliances could come under pressure. And millions of people across the world would suddenly realize that this was never just another regional dispute. This is why governments, intelligence agencies, and military analysts are watching the situation so carefully tonight. Because, despite the uncertainty, many experts agree on one thing: the current crisis feels different, more serious, more unstable, and potentially far more dangerous than previous confrontations between Washington and Tehran. Now the world is waiting to see who makes the next move. Will diplomacy still be enough to stop the escalation? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a conflict that could reshape the entire region? Because at this point, the real fear is no longer whether tensions exist. The real fear is how far those tensions are willing to go.